Can everybody hear me okay? Yep, great. So I'll tell you a little bit about Hyper before we start. So Hyper has developed this program with Callaghan Innovation. So Hyper's been going for about 3 years. And we focus on a couple of different things. We look at the Build for Speed program, but we also take those skills and we work out with people developing software, architectural work as well. So we're hands-on, we build complex distributed systems. We use all of the practices that we talk about and that we look for in other companies. And so we find that it's a very nice match. We have to be hands-on, we have to be doing this work to be able to stay relevant and offer good advice. So I'd like to talk to you a bit today about Build for Speed. So this is a program that we've developed with Callaghan Innovation. It's been going for about 2.5, almost 3 years now. It started off as a pilot with just a few companies. And really what we were trying to do is to encourage startups to think about some of the practices that can help them to scale and grow as they go on their journey of finding customers and building up their businesses. And try and look for opportunities to interact with them reasonably early, try and give them a bit of warning about what they might need to be thinking about if they're not thinking about that already. And also it's provided an opportunity to collect some really rich data across the different companies that we've worked with. So over the 2.5, 3 years, we've worked with over 40 software product companies in New Zealand. They've ranged from very small companies through to companies that have been going for over 25 years and different sizes and scales. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. The Build for Speed process itself, so this is, there are 2 parts to it. So the first part is what we call discovery. And this is where we'll spend a day collaboratively working with a company, listening to what they have to say in terms of where the improvements in their company might be, but also throwing in some of our experience, what we know works well from the work that we do and what we see others doing around the world. Before we go in, we send some pre-engagement materials. We like to understand, let's have a look at some code samples, look at some requirements, look at some examples of some bugs, how people describe the system that they're working in, and that gives us a sense before we even get in there about what people are thinking about in the company and where we might want to dig into a bit more detail. When we're in there, we sort of structure the day so that we start with a high-level view. We look at the business, where it's growing, where it's going, what the challenges are currently, what the predicted challenges might be. And what we're really trying to do is understand the context of the business. So we're not just giving the same advice to people over and over. It's actually really trying to focus on that particular context and what might be important for that company. And then we structure the day so that we dig into more detail as we go through the day. We always bring people together at the end and try and have a group-based kind of retrospective to understand how the group operates together as well. Then we write up a lightweight report which has the observations and the actions, and we send that back to the companies. And then from there, it's completely up to them what they'd like to do. Some companies choose to take on a whole bunch of those actions. Sometimes it's stuff they're already aware about. Other times there's a lot of new and interesting actions in there. And then from there, they may choose to go on to the second step, which is discovery. And that's where we can give them some help around a specific item or a couple of items. Deep dive, sorry. So what are the types of companies? So it's really focused around companies that have found a market. So post-validation startups. So they've gone through discovery, they've gone through some validation, they've found a market, and now they're experiencing some growth around that. The types of companies that we've worked with has been an incredible range. I mean, it literally has been from two people in a garage through to companies that have been going for 25 years plus with hundreds of people. We've managed to make it work for all of those companies, but we do have some caveats around narrowing the focus for the larger companies. What we do see is with the larger companies, often the challenges one team will have are common, or there are patterns across the company as well. So really, we're focusing on how do we help companies be more efficient and scale with some of these different ideas. So underneath this, we've developed our own improvement model. It is an improvement model. This is the thing that we emphasize the most. It doesn't matter where you are right now. It's how do you improve over time, and how do you understand how you've made those improvements and where you still need to improve. So this model is a synthesis from a whole lot of different work around the world, plus our own IP. There's about 250 questions that we processed in the background. It's a tri-state type of model. In other words, We try and keep the questions very binary, yes, no, or they just don't apply, in which case, if they don't apply because it doesn't suit that company's context or their scale, then we just don't include that in the scores. And as you can see, we cover different areas. It's a very holistic view of software product delivery and software product company. Everything from teams and culture through architecture, continuous delivery, and each of those sections. They're all relevant. They all have different meaning and different importance for each company, but they're all important. We've also validated the model against what we knew was a very successful, very strong development team. This is for a company that has had very rapid growth from both business and then the technology's been able to support that. So a very successful company in New Zealand. And unsurprisingly, they scored incredibly highly in the model. But they also gave us feedback and helped us to validate that. The model itself we're constantly updating because as we do work for our clients, we know that we change, we learn all of the time, and we have to feed that back into the model. So here we can see we've got an average of the build for speed companies. So about 40 companies. And then I'm also going to talk today, I'm going to talk about the patterns that we've seen across the 40 companies. I'm also going to talk about, we've had the pleasure of going back and talking to 8 of those companies and actually doing a second cut with them about where they've improved. And we're going to show some of the results and the feedback from those companies as well. The unfortunate sort of green New Zealand shaped central, that's the lowest. So just to give you an indication of range. So we really are seeing, across these different companies, really big ranges across all of these different areas. So here are some results. I'll just give you a moment to read them, and I'll talk through a couple. So some cool stuff going on here, right? So this is the companies that we've gone back to visit. This is after a year and a half. We're around about a year to 2 year would be the gap. So when we started the program until we went and revisited, this is 8 of the companies out of 40. And these are the comments. So we did interviews with them, and then we went back through the model and updated that based on empirical evidence that they could show us and conversations that we had with them. So some pretty awesome stuff going on here. So release time down from 2 months to 2 days. So here was a company. They're building a product. It's an international product. They kind of knew that they needed to improve in this area, but they were sort of stuck with doing the work to keep the product moving versus actually creating some capacity to make some improvements. And I think one of the big things they got out of the process was actually people coming in and validating that actually where you are right now, you need to make some improvements. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to scale and you're going to get yourself into a whole lot more cost and trouble down the track. And that created some alignment with the teams and the founders of the organisation. They were able to carve up some capacity even though they were super busy and under a lot of pressure. And they got some really big results out of that. And then there's, I think, 20 times faster for specific components. I'll talk about that a little bit more in the quality section. So this is related to different practices, micro-testing, and how that changes the way you actually develop code. Quite a few of the companies, as we'll see, have increased their speed to value, so with continuous delivery type of practices. This was an interesting one. Velocity doubled in the last 6 months. Over that time, the team have grown from 12 to 14 developers. And really, this was one where it was a cultural impact, so a lot more visibility, transparency around work, coupled with some better technical practices, and suddenly they were able to really find some focus. So we all know that technical debt is bad, but I think we have to be aware of the context. It's a bit more complicated than that. We can't just go into companies and say all technical debt is bad, because that really invalidates how they've got to where they are. And it's a very complex set of trade-offs that we see. It's very hard to be successful as a software product company. There are no companies without technical debt. Every company has technical debt. It's, are you thinking about it consciously? Are you in control of it? Have you made good trade-off decisions? Are you aware of some of the practices that can help you to make better trade-off decisions? Are you aware of where you are as a company in terms of growth? Because that can make a really big impact. When you start out as a startup, you may be just trying to get out in the market and test as many ideas as you want, and you'll trade off quality to get some bites from customers and know where to focus and where to go with that product. But at a certain point, that's going to start costing you. And what we find is that a lot of companies they're unaware of where they sit on that curve. They're on the wrong side of that curve, and that's something that we really try and help to show them. So I'll talk about some of the patterns that we've seen across all 40 of these companies. So all of the companies that we did see had issues with architectural debt, technical debt, and that was at the micro level and at the macro level. So some of these companies, and again, this is about context, some of these companies didn't need complex architectures to be a really good business. Others did, and some of the ones that did knew they were in trouble but didn't know how to move to that next stage. Some of them knew what they should be doing, and it was just tweaks in terms of guidance. But some really diverse architectures, everything from quite simple model view controller type, server-side rendered sort of applications through to fully distributed, very complex architectures. We've done work with very interesting companies. It's been a real privilege actually to see some of these different architectures and products that are going on in New Zealand. We've got people, scientists taking complex weather models, having to figure out ways of presenting huge data sets and completely different architectures than we'd see in a typical business domain. So very, very interesting work. So we've got some that have got what we call scale fail. So they're unable to be the company that they want to be. They know they've got customer demand right now, and they can't take that architecture is not going to support them in the future. And so because of the work we do outside of Build for Speed, we're almost always able to provide some guidance around that. It's been a real pleasure and a privilege. I've worked with a chap called Rick Mugridge, he's been instrumental in helping to create this program with myself and others in Hyper. And just to have people of that talent who have got that depth of experience and can work across those different architectures is a huge advantage for us, and we can pass that on to the clients as well. One of the other big things we've observed is there are lots of code smells. Every company we go into, their code is it's smelly. By smelly, it doesn't smell too good. So it's a code smell is a way of describing a pattern. So rather than code best practices, we describe smells. So things to avoid, things to recognize as a team and refactor away from. And what we find is a lot of those small scale code smells are often reflected in the larger scale architecture as well. So awareness in the small is great for learning, and then that gets reflected over time in the larger scale architectures. One of the other patterns we see is key person risk. So again, when you start out, you're a small company, often a really common pattern is a technical and a business founder. The technical person is doing some development work, then they build a team around that person. But often we see that person doesn't know when to step back and let go and actually encourage other people to learn and to get the tacit knowledge out of their heads through automation and other practices. And so that's a real trap. So one of the other really common patterns is anybody aware of the test automation pyramid? People heard of that? Anybody heard of the ice cream cone of death? Okay, so it's the upside down version. So this is the ice cream cone of death. So what we found is that a lot of the startups, very few are doing test automation. All of them are suffering from it. And a lot of them had the same response, we just want to move really, really fast, and so we don't have time to do micro testing. And then we'd ask, so how much time do you spend rework, with bugs coming back through and having to rework that bit of code or just supporting bugs in production? And the typical answer would be around 20, 30, 40%, sometimes 50 or 60% of their time. So guess what? If you invest a little bit of that time in micro testing and layered test automation, you get all of that time back. And so there's a system that we're building at the moment, complex distributed system. We've been building it for about the last year, and we've got thousands of micro tests. We've had one production defect, and we spend 0 time doing rework because we've got a really, really solid layered test automation in there. So that's where we're trying to encourage teams to get to. And we're also recognizing that it takes time to learn those skills. You don't learn that overnight. It's great if you can see that by bringing people in or by getting that knowledge externally as well. The other pattern here again, we often see founders, they're keeping their quality up reasonably high because the founders are so involved in the testing process, which works for a period of time, but then they get to a certain period of success and suddenly they've got to move away from that, and all of that tacit knowledge about the product and the intricacies of the product, it's very hard to pass that over to someone else. So they experience this big gap because they don't have the test automation, those people have to pull back as the team grows, and suddenly now they've got a really big quality issue that they struggle with. So here are some results around quality. So here are the companies that have employed some of the practices, especially around micro-testing. That's one of the big things that we push, and some of the benefits that they've got out of this. So reduction in production incidents, higher test automation coverage, which is just a sign that things are going in the right direction. But then we get the economic benefits. So 20 times faster to develop specific components. This is a fantastic story. So this company was one of the developers. In fact, two of them were very experienced guys. They've been around for a long time, and they were really capable. One of them even had micro-testing skills, but he wasn't using them because the culture in the company said you've got to get this stuff done really, really fast, and he thought that was the best way to do it. So we were able to get support from leadership to encourage those practices. He was able to restart doing that stuff. And then he found all these really subtle but very compelling things started to happen. He was firing up the application to do work every time he wanted to check something. Now, for these specific components, he's just working with micro-tests, writing micro-tests, getting them to pass. Suddenly, he's firing up the application maybe twice a day as opposed to every 10 minutes. And he stayed in that context of highly productive development, and he just found that everything went so much faster and was higher quality. And it was just that shift, really, of encouraging people to do these things and getting that support from the rest of the organisation that can make such a big impact. The other thing that's super important in the quality side, it's about the collaborative practices. So we're very strong on the specification by example type practices. In fact, Rick wrote the first book about that, and those are kind of, I guess, his ideas. So we definitely try and take that to companies and just encourage people to, look at the work collaboratively before you start it, drive out examples, and then we've even run workshops with companies, with teams, to get them to understand how to do that, and then how that flows into test automation, so it becomes part of the same process. So this particular company, so they got a big lift in quality, but they also, because of the collaborative specifications, they got a lift around the requirements and the planning process as well. So continuous delivery. So this is around how do you automate the deployment and release of your product, how do you automate your infrastructure, and then how do you apply that automated testing to that process. So the trends across the 40 companies, so we saw a huge variety. We saw multi-million-dollar revenue companies with no source control, which kind of blew us away actually, but also scared the bejesus out of us as well. But we'll show you some results from that company and what they were able to do quite quickly. We saw a lot of companies with long-lived physical branches and lots of them, and all of the pain of merging and trying to keep things in sync. We're a little bit radical. We promote no physical branches because we find CD is a whole lot easier, and you can get to higher levels of maturity with that if you use other technical practices along with that. We saw of the 40 companies that there was limited CI with some of them, most of them probably, but almost all of them lacked automation around deployment initially. Very few companies running tests of any kind, build servers, including micro-tests. We use the term micro-test for tiny little tests. We found that unit testing is so ambiguous as a term, we've stopped using it, so we use the industrial logic micro-testing, which is tiny little tests, like a function or a method level tests. So that's where we encourage people to start with test automation. Sometimes packaging and versioning, problematic or non-existent. And then the concept of the build pipeline, people not understanding that, hey, you shouldn't really be branching by environment. You shouldn't really be creating different packages and then deploying them, because those are all changes and you're not testing those changes. And then no acceptance tests. We didn't see any companies across the 40 with automated acceptance tests, which is really interesting. So here are a couple of companies that had the best results around CD. So this company was really interesting. This was a successful company. This is a very smart founder technology-wise, very savvy, great communication with customers, managed to build out a fantastic product, had over $1 million of revenue and no source control and all sorts of crazy things going on there. And it was just because he wasn't really aware of that stuff. There was a little bit of like, well, it works for us now. But then when we explained to him, well, what's going to happen over the next year? How are you going to grow the company? How are you going to bring people in? What's that experience going to be like for people? If those practices aren't there, how are people going to fit into a culture? They're going to be brought, it's going to be really hard working with junior or intermediate people because there's going to be nothing for them to follow. You're going to have to invent all of that stuff as you bring people in, and it's going to cause a lot of confusion. So they were really smart. They didn't have those skills, so we gave them some help. But they also found someone in the marketplace who was very, very strong. And that person was able to kind of see the team, bring some of those skills in, and they made some great progress in that space. These guys were really interesting in the sense that, again, they did the same thing. They brought someone in. They actually found that they didn't have the skills to go to the next level as a company, so they brought in a new kind of a coding CTO. And this person was able to make some really impressive changes. But I think the telling sign here is that behind each of these graphs is a story, right? I mean, you can get a view of what's going on by looking at this, but there's a story. And this one, you can see that nothing else really changed. And the story behind this is that there was still a cultural issue here. There was still the founder of the company pushing the development team really hard to just get stuff done, and it created a big mess. And then it created a tension, which was quite sort of toxic as well, because the developers wanted to do the right thing, the business was under pressure to get some stuff out the door, and they could never quite find the right balance. So it's great that they were able to make that progress, but still some big issues to tackle there. I think one of the other big things that we found is, there's not a lot of experience from how do you run a good software product company in New Zealand? So we're finding businesses, these are amazingly innovative businesses, but they don't have that experience. So they don't have someone with software product experience. So we see all of the issues that come out of that. So no common language around requirements. So we don't know if we're talking about stories or features or something else. Still locked into project thinking. So we're thinking about short-term gains. We're not thinking about long-term. We're not thinking about managing it as a product, stable teams, not visualizing work, so we don't know where we are. Creates tension. I mean, we had a classic example just a few weeks ago where we've got the CEO bemoaning this development team that he can't tell what they're doing, and a really, really good development team, but there's this massive gap, and there's no one in there to support visualizing work and trying to create that transparency of information at all levels in the organization. And then all of the things when you don't visualize work, you don't know where the queues are. Large batch size, we saw this problem over and over again. We saw companies where they'll just batch stuff up into 6 months worth of work before they get it out. And these are companies that are still being successful. And so there's a lot of room to move there in terms of breaking stuff up, and the continuous delivery goes kind of hand in glove with that as well. I guess another really strong theme is this no measurement. There's not a lot of empirical understanding of process and how teams are improving. So as Deming has said, survival is optional. So of the 8 companies that we went to do back to do the reviews, they weren't all successes. In fact, these were probably the poorest performing ones. But again, there's a story behind these charts as well. So this company was really interesting in the sense that they had a pretty good business and they had some really good opportunities for growth. But they also had a difficulty with the leadership in terms of knowing what a good software product company looks like, and that it's not a command control structure. They had very weak technologists, and so they had a lot of architectural debt. And they found that they'd also done the other classic mistake of the version 2, trying to fix all their problems in one go. They spent about $1.5 million on a version 2 of their product and couldn't ship it. So they didn't think about the problems of actually joining those products together and actually running the cost of running those 2 products at the end. So almost disastrous for them. So we came back after a year, and they had to face up the fact that they hadn't really made any of these improvements, even though they really desperately wanted to. And so at that point, we were actually able to give them a bit of extra help, and now it'd be great to see this chart, I think, in a few months' time, because we know that they are actually starting to make improvements, but it was hard for them to start. It was really culturally hard for them to start because of the mistakes that they made. This one is kind of interesting as well. So this is a large company. This is a company that's been going for over 25 years in New Zealand, almost 200 people. And for them, change was also really, really hard. They desperately wanted to change and improve, but at the same time, they've got big customers in the States. They're fully embedded in these other organisations as part of the systems that manage the factories. And so change for them was really high risk. They had people that knew how to keep this system going with all of its flaws. And so to do anything with that required a lot of learning for a lot of people in the company, and it would also require a change in culture. This is a risk-averse company. So they're finding it really, really hard. Now the challenge is that up till now they've survived perfectly fine and they've got a very good company. But going forward, those barriers to entry, they're just not there anymore. And so the worry these guys have now is other people are going to get in and disrupt them, and they can't find a way of disrupting themselves. So that's a big challenge. What we did see across the 8 companies that we went back to revisit is there were some really significant improvements. So this is the average. So there are a really wide range here. But we can see that on average, across all of the areas, we saw improvements across all 8 of those companies. So, we can't tell this is a complex adaptive system that we're working in, so we don't know if this is going to necessarily mean, that these companies are going to be absolutely more successful. But we know there are enough stories around, there's enough compelling evidence to show that, there's only so far you can go if you've got these kind of limitations around the way you're working in terms of process and architecture and technical practices. So these companies are improving, and the odds of them being more successful, you would have to hope, are increasing. So I think the other good news is that we're starting to see some really strong companies now as well. So of the 40 companies that we've been to, this is probably one of the strongest ones that we've seen architecturally. These guys are building a complex distributed system using some really interesting technology that's absolutely appropriate for the business. They've got layered test automation. They've got very good continuous delivery in terms of infrastructure, deployment, and testing. And they've got some room to move in terms of improvement around visualization and flow, but at the same time, they're doing some great stuff. So we're starting to see an even broader range of these companies as we look at more companies in New Zealand as well. So, culture eats story points for breakfast. So I think this is probably the biggest thing I've found. And now I feel like I can kind of walk into a company and I can sense very quickly whether, what that culture's like. So that we start the discovery day with the business founders, and we get them with the team, just talk about the company and describe it, and and very quickly we'll get a sense of how people communicate, how people are aligned to the vision of the company, the strategy of the company, how people can describe things. Like the second session we do is around architecture. And these attributes are incredibly powerful. If people can articulate what the business is, how they work together, if they can get in front of a whiteboard and draw up an architecture in a way that's that vision that everybody has that can be described, that makes sense, then there's some good stuff going on here. Sometimes we'll spend an hour with the founders. We won't know what they're doing. It's so hard to understand because they can't articulate to us. That's a problem. This culture is pervasive. It's either going to drive you in the right direction or it's going to massively slow you down. And so if you don't have that as a foundation, it doesn't matter if you're doing good stories. It ain't going to help you. And I think that's, those are the things that we start to look for as well. This company was really interesting in the sense that they had obviously pretty basic kind of practices going on. They had quite old school CEO at the time, but they also realised that they were going to get disrupted and they had to make some big changes. So this is over quite a broad time period. So this is over 2 years, these changes. And this company actually made changes across a whole raft of different areas. They went from siloed teams, the old school kind of analysis development teams and then QA teams to cross-functional teams. They started to incorporate some of the cultural aspects of Agile in terms of the teams, trying to create some more autonomy and empowerment for the teams, tried to give the teams space to learn new technology. They brought in new senior people into the company to support that because they knew they didn't have the right people at the time. They started to look at their architecture. They've also invested really heavily in continuous delivery. And going back after 2 years, it's kind of like a different company, And these guys, they've got a much stronger chance of surviving now. And they know they're going to be disrupted soon. They've been around for a while as well. They're over 100 people. But now they're in a much stronger position to try and defend that or disrupt themselves, come up with a new product themselves. So it's really, really exciting to see that kind of progress. I think the other big thing here is that the leadership style changed as well. So from leaders that were coordinating or being the experts, they shifted to leaders that were helping to develop people. And again, that just gave people the space to learn new skills. And guess what? There are a whole bunch of really, really smart people in there, and they're actually able to learn some new skills and do some great stuff. So to summarise, so there's a fantastic study actually, the Genome Startup Report that came out of the States. And I would have to agree that their findings, we found the same thing. The ability of the founders and the teams to learn is probably the highest indicator that we've seen of success. If people can create that space to learn new ideas, they can bring that into the way they work. If founders, and this comes back to the culture, if people are resistant or reluctant to take on board new ideas, it's going to be really hard for that company to grow and change. If people are really keen on learning, if they're looking for new opportunities, the conversations we're having with them, they're excited and they want to understand more about things that could help them as a business, well, guess what? They tend to learn more, and they tend to learn faster, and they tend to get a lot better over a shorter period of time. And then I think the other thing is the balance. You can't be. It's like a friend of mine who he's got a business making coffee. He said there's 100 ways to ruin a cup of coffee, and I think there's probably 1,000 ways to ruin a software product. And you've got to be constantly alert to what is the current thing that you need to be focusing on. And it's very dynamic. Those trade-offs are incredibly complicated. They change very quickly. And you've got to have the skills there to find that balance and to continue to find that balance over time. So you've got to have the people that can look out for those challenges. I think that's just that balance of the technical agility with the business agility, and to keep an eye on both of those kind of areas, but that balance, the way they interact with each other, is incredibly important.